General for the Union, Ulysses S. Grant, and the battle that made him famous, the Battle of Shiloh. Economic strain that the country endured during the war, and also the Battle of Gettysburg. As mentioned with your notes on Antietam, Antietam gave Lincoln the confidence to issue a document that would begin the freeing of slaves. This document freed slaves in all states outside of the Union control, so the Confederacy, and this would go into place if the Confederacy did not rejoin the Union by January 1st. Lincoln did not free all slaves at this point because he didn't want to lose support of those border states like Maryland and Kentucky that stayed with the Union even though they were slave states. So this document was a very important document in our country's history because it was the first to free slaves and to start that process towards equality. The Emancipation Proclamation also had two major effects. One was that black soldiers were now allowed to fight for the Union for the first time, so you start to see black regiments in the Union Army. It also tied slavery directly to the war. Although many of us believe that slavery was the major underlying issue for the war, up until this point it was majorly dependent on states' rights. Over here there's a flyer that calls for African Americans to join the Union Army. So they start to try to get more and more troops to join. We've spent most of our time in this unit talking about Robert E. Lee and his successes in the South, and now we're going to move to the most successful general of the Union Army, Ulysses S. Grant. He was unlike McClellan, who was general during Antietam, and took a lot of chances, which ended up working in the Union's favor. He was responsible for taking over much of the Mississippi River in order to control it for the Union's favor as well. Ulysses S. Grant will become president after Lincoln's predecessor, Andrew Johnson, and he'll be known as being a very controversial person, but a very strong military figure. He becomes a strong figure in Union's history through the Battle of Shiloh. In April of 1862, the Confederates attacked Grant's Union troops in Tennessee. So he was in charge of much of the western part of the state, whereas McClellan was more of the east. The Confederates were surprised by the Union troops and were met with a hornet's nest of bullets, or many, many bullets, or volleys, if you remember that term from our primary reading sources. Both sides suffered great casualties, but the Union did win this battle. And after Antietam, we start to see more wins, and also after the Battle of Shiloh, so like a turning point for the war, at least temporarily. Although the North's industry was doing very well by producing supplies for the war, which we saw in the video, there was a shortage of workers due to people joining the military. Because of the economic strain that the shortage of workers put on the nation, Congress levied the first income tax to pay for war. An income tax is the tax they take out of your paycheck. So if you think about when you have a job and maybe your paycheck is $50, you're earning $10 an hour and you work 5 hours that week. Your income tax comes out of your check as a percentage of that pay. This is a lot of times what you hear your parents complain about or other people with jobs, and when you have your first job, you'll see the income tax. This is the first time that this happened, and it's not necessarily a bad thing because we were able to pay for war, but that process stuck. One thing that Congress did that was not very successful was that they printed an additional $400 million in paper money. Now, just because you have more of the actual bills, the paper money, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have more money, and we've talked about this in the past. This caused extreme inflation, so prices would rise to ridiculous rates. As you'll see in the next slide, the price of shoes went up tremendously. And this wasn't one of Lincoln's great successes, because you should never print more money than you actually have in the bank, because that just makes that dollar worth even less. The South was not able to trade for goods, and that caused a greater shortage and even greater inflation. So the South saw even more economic strain than the North did. An example would be that shoes that would cost $18 then cost $800 after inflation, making it nearly impossible for anyone to buy anything and for businesses to make money because no one could buy their product. Also, food shortages due to the lack of supplies led to riots. So not only did we have violence going on due to the war, but also because people couldn't get the resources that they needed to survive. Although we did have victories for the North with Shiloh and Antietam, poor leadership in the North, not under Grant, but mostly under McClellan, did lead to more Confederate victories. The generals were replaced twice, so McClellan would then be replaced by Grant, but they only found more losses. The next major battle that we're going to discuss is the Battle of Gettysburg. After several Confederate victories, Lee was convinced that a win in the North would end the war, so he took his troops to Pennsylvania, and he thought if he could win this battle that the war would end. 85,000 Union soldiers faced 75,000 Confederate soldiers in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And this turned into a 3-day bloody battle where we had more losses than we ever had before in a battle. One of the most famous parts of the Battle of Gettysburg was Pickett's charge. 15,000 Confederate soldiers advanced towards the Union line, and nearly half of them were killed or wounded as they approached Union artillery. So they were unprepared, and Lee ended up not getting his victory. He lost nearly a third of his men and blamed himself, and from that point, Lee won't be the same. The stress that was put on him mentally due to this loss was almost too much for him to bear for the rest of the war. So a loss at Gettysburg and then another loss at Vicksburg, which happened right by each other, created the major turning point for the Union. So we had a small one with Antietam, but the Confederates continued to win after Antietam and Shiloh. But then Gettysburg really showed that the Union now had it together, and the Confederates took too big of a loss. One of the most famous speeches in our nation's history is the Gettysburg Address. In November of 1863, 15,000 people gathered at the battlefield to honor those who died because there had been so many losses. It didn't really matter which side it was on. Lincoln addressed the nation as he looked ahead toward Union victory, but he did commemorate the losses that happened in the war, but kind of asked the question, at what risk? And we'll take a look at this speech in class later this week. Interesting facts about the Gettysburg Address: it's one of the most famous, well-written speeches in history and is acclaimed as that by many historians. And Lincoln wrote it on just a scrap piece of paper on his way to Gettysburg, so very quick. It's not like what we have today where presidents prepare for weeks or even months to make a speech. Lincoln had to come up with this very quickly, and his speech should make a major impact on the country.